I have always had a suspicion about the God of the gaps objection, which atheists will frequently use. The intuition behind the idea had always seemed to grasp only one half of the story. There was always a sense in which a God in the gaps captured precisely something about the essence of the divine in the first place. There is, of course, a point that the atheist is making. Our knowledge has in some sense replaced the need for God in certain areas. It seems we no longer need to invoke the idea of God to explain something miraculous, like lightning. We can talk about it happening in a naturalistic way, where the process seems at heart to be entirely indifferent to us. But there is a side of the story which usually gets overlooked. Even if humans have previously been wrong about the thunder gods of the sky, it is not clear that their account of the world was entirely irrational. It is conceivable that attributing the workings of the sky to a personal deity is a move too hasty and presumptuous. But then again, there is also a sense in which this theological speculation provides the most compelling account available for the time one finds themselves. The God of the Gaps argument, of course, wishes to point out the pattern of a series of mistakes which humans have made, noting that this theological impulse appears fundamentally error-ridden, to be replaced by the new value of rationality, however nascent its form might still be. But the deeper question is whether all our doubts which turn us towards God will eventually be reconciled in this manner, or even could be. And this is the deeper question which seems to actually get to the heart of the matter for the theist. But if, as the God of the Gaps argument suggests, we will continue to replace our need for God further and further, then by what means should we even speak of God? And by what means will we speak of anything at all, which works neither by a predictable necessity, nor of fancy and chance? Such will be a primary investigation of this video. When addressing the God of the Gaps argument, we must address the current shortcomings of our knowledge, which are the grounds of appeal towards a God. There are many problems which pose a serious issue for this modern rationalism, some of which seemingly have no promising prospect of a solution. Many are waking up to the fact that the world cannot be accounted for by the paradigm of modern Enlightenment thought, that something consistently seems to stand outside any system, maze or matrix of modern materialism, a side to reality which possesses an irreducible quality. Perhaps we cannot hope to even provide a solution in principle. And therefore there is a side to reality that takes on the appearance of something necessarily miraculous and living, separate from the domain of the tyrannical and egoic intellect. My aim is not solely to demonstrate the validity of these problems, but more so that these problems do not promise to go away, and how we can even make sense of the world thereafter. Consciousness poses one such intractable problem. There is something about consciousness which appears insurmountably difficult to reconcile with our understanding of physical reality or the physical brain, and likewise something to the mind which transcends our typical understanding of computational or functional systems. Consciousness has been rebranded in contemporary philosophy as a form of computer, something which is equivalent only to its function. This is particularly distasteful to those who believe that such a theory of mind fails to account for the nature of the observer itself. To a similarly idealist eye, function can in essence be regarded as a result, perhaps only a perceived result. It is the outcome of certain operations of language. And by language I understand something broader than the strictly verbal. But there may exist qualities of the mind which are distinct from any functional outcome at all. These, for example, have been named qualia in the philosophy of mind. One of the most prevalent objections to functionalism is the argument from inverse qualia, where one's mind could be functionally identical to another, receiving the same inputs and producing the same outputs, yet qualitatively different on the level of experience. I might have an identical physical clone who was by any means indistinguishable from me, but they would lack the same richness of experience as I possess. And while I can perceive this to be a possibility, there is something about my experience which remains entirely ineffable. The functionalist could object that our qualia cannot truly be different with no functional difference whatsoever. There is some intrinsic functional state of red as redness itself, which would be expressed differently if my red and your green were to be swapped, perhaps this is a distinguishing emotional character. It is worth considering whether you believe this inversion is possible. Perhaps most intractable of all, however, is explaining how functional states in a conscious mind can coalesce in a meaningful unity. Machine functionalism equivocates consciousness with machine states, a set of information expressible through zeros and ones. The problem that arises is that such a theory does not easily map onto our intuitions about how we might wish to attribute an identity to conscious things. Ned Block made a famous objection against this functionalism, hypothesizing that if 1 billion people were connected with radios, mimicking the neurons within a brain by sending radio signals to one another, then it would be possible for a nation such as China to functionally recreate a human mind across this gigantic scale, and that therefore, this collective group of people as a whole would realize the same human consciousness possessed by you or I. But even if a functionalist accepts this possibility, another intractable problem lies in explaining how this consciousness belongs to a locality in the first place, how functional states in a finite but not immediate vicinity will coalesce into a single mind, why the functional states of my biology are the limit of my conscious experience, and not the functional states in close proximity to me, say the states related to the air around my skin. In other words, functionalism struggles to point to a reason why my mind only possesses the functional states which we know to be relevant from the inside. Explaining why I am not conscious of proximal functional states seems an arbitrary task, and at the least requires further explanation than functionalist metaphysics alone. But another seemingly intractable problem rests in whether they can provide an adequate account of what information is in the first place, what a 1 is compared to a 0. How exactly information can be defined by reference only to functional states is a mystery. Imagine the simplest of possible worlds where only 2 machine states exist, one represented by a 1 and the other by a 0. Machine functionalism holds these simple minds as fundamentally distinct from one another, but distinct in what dimension? One might wish to describe state 1 as the simplest unit of conscious awareness. But awareness of what? Machine functionalism already holds that this consciousness is expressible by machine states alone, so we cannot refer to any intrinsic property of experience as a starting point. But crucially, we also cannot refer to any external functional states or relationships either, since in our thought experiment we are looking at the simplest of possible worlds. The problem again seems intractable, and here that slogan rings so loud and clear. Give us one free miracle, and we will explain the rest. The somewhat ironic Dawkins trope with which the new rationalism substitutes for the God of the gaps. Except the pattern plays out in far more places than was originally foreseen, beyond simply the cosmological origins of the universe. Gödel's incompleteness theorem has been used to argue against the computational theory of mind further by Lucas and Penrose. Gödel demonstrates that a consistent formal system, i.e. a computer, is never able to prove that it is incomplete. However, our understanding of the incompleteness theorem seems to suggest that we do have knowledge that, were we a computer, we would also be incomplete. If the argument is successful, it seems to get at a similar idea to the irreducibility of consciousness, that there is something about what it is to know and perceive which cannot be described in our usual mechanistic terms. Penrose therefore concludes that something about the operation of consciousness must take place on the quantum level if it were to avoid this problem. But such a conclusion still leaves us with an undeniably strange and incomplete understanding of the mind, of how consciousness can have a function that is indeterminate and or probabilistic. The new atheist turn of phrase which goes, "Give us one free miracle and we will explain the rest," becomes increasingly ironic. Not only is the problem utterly untrivial, but this one free miracle manifests as a pattern repeatedly and across more dimensions than one tends to think. Another direct insight into this comes from the fine-tuning argument, which states it is far more likely for this universe to produce the conscious life we see, given a God, rather than naturalism. Everything of value and significance thereafter pours from this one miracle. And so what is at the heart of this problem for the mechanistic image of the mind? And by what means can we understand anything real about consciousness which cannot be expressed in such terms? What I believe is taking place across these separate scenarios is the observation of the effect of a certain function of consciousness. It arises from the act of plastering language over the world and giving it form, seeking a total dominion and mastery over the phenomena which might then appear. There is a relentless impulse to master the world in this way. On one level, it will put our anxieties to rest, making us feel like we are equipping ourselves with tools to keep a proper order in the world. This is consistent with theories of the left and right brain, the left brain being both responsible for language and the inhibition of negative emotion. But when we fall into the egoic trap of making ourselves the master of the world, we are almost by default in a state of blindness. This is the impulse of Eliade, the demiurge, the blind tyrant god which constructed the material world to imprison mankind and trap his divine essence, too arrogant to recognize the true nature of the divine above. I can't help but notice the striking similarity in the story of the Gnostic demiurge and the way in which we shape the world with language and ego. The demiurge blindly thinks himself to be God, trying to imprison mankind in a material prison to contain the immaterial soul and stop him from reaching gnosis. Likewise, our use of language traps an experience which is fundamentally alive, intractable and transcendent into various categories, seeking to contain it where it becomes still and dead, so that we might have total dominion over it, despite its fundamental ineffability. In the gaps is therefore perhaps precisely where we will always find God, so long as we remain humble and open enough not to be under the grip of this blind tyrant. When we think verbally, we categorize the world, drawing boundaries, which in turn enable us to become ever more precise, exacting, and to draw new boundaries in every gap. But the gaps will always remain. I ask again whether it was ever irrational for our forefathers to believe the life around us could only have been shaped by God. As our knowledge has expanded, we have become able to explain life with the story of evolution, but not fully, and new gaps have emerged where it seems only God may be a fitting explanation. One therefore wonders about the extent to which pride has played in our newfound confidence in rationalism. But it is not that such a conclusion comes without its profound difficulties either. Speaking meaningfully about something which is not deterministic, nor simply probabilistic, is exceedingly difficult, for the reason that it will run contrary to something a word wishes to express in the first place, at least a word without tone, rhythm, or context. A word wants to see the world in unchanging snapshots, tools to analyze the world with order and accuracy, and something which is neither deterministic nor random must be somewhat unpredictable, at least from the perspective of one who is perceiving. A word which alludes to such things then seems bound to become dated, and that will no doubt cast suspicion over our attempts to even allude to it with our language at all. I suspect that this is, in some very real sense, where the notion of faith plays such a powerful role. Imagine the story of Abraham, commanded to sacrifice Isaac. His faith leads him to the top of the mountain, where he sees a lamb and by God's mercy keeps his son. The statement that God provided the lamb and that material causes and desires led the lamb up the mountain are both perfectly compatible. An intuition is quite a fitting example to demonstrate how we could understand things neither random nor deterministic. Intuitions allow us to form knowledge in a way beyond the aspects accounted for by rationality alone. At the heart of our intuitions is a relationship to knowledge that is neither. It seeks something that it can't quite find, beyond reason but not left to chance either. Its success and proximity being determined by some other factor. The rationalist of course will try to offer an explanation for intuition that falls back on the computational or the random. But as we have seen before, our intuitions often have such power that they ignite in us a desire to cast out these explanations, and this nonetheless fails to change the fact that we can understand things without calling these concepts to mind. Another side to the problem comes from recognizing that this aspect of divinity manifests as something both immutable and in constant transition. Every time we look at it, it changes, and every time we go to observe the world, we cast our net of language further out, creating a larger conceptual maze where our term God becomes more and more redundant, speaking on the local scale, that is. There is a similarity between this notion and the observer effect in quantum physics, where the act of measuring is what collapses the waveform of unconscious pre-linguistic activity into something definite and concrete, something which the intellect then rules over and calls real. This might happen both when we speak a word, but also when our unconscious, our dreams, our anima, successfully communicates something to the ego. And this is perhaps the best way in which I can think to explain it. And I think this model of consciousness is backed up by the modern understanding of the left and right hemispheres split. The left hemisphere is our linguistic hemisphere, responsible for the majority of our conscious activity, and shapes the world into words, things, and tools. The right brain is known as the big picture thinker. It makes abstract connections often far beyond our conscious understanding. It's responsible for more of our negative emotion and picks up on threat and novelty. As such, novel, unconscious and pre-linguistic aspects of reality will always saturate and dictate the scene of our conscious experience. They are fundamental to us in the first place, at least to the bicameral mind. It is in this engagement with the novel and unknown where that which is considered miraculous or divine will often manifest itself. Although even our linguistic side does contain that same impression of that irreducible essence we have discussed. As we believe we have discovered more and more about the laws of the universe, to the extent where it no longer appears novel nor intrigues us with its mythical quality, the divine will naturally separate from such a domain, at least when no interesting mystery and problem can be unearthed. Despite our impression of the divine as something immutable, there is a practical sense in which it is ever-changing. To the degree to which we wish to approach it and understand it, our finite perspective of it will shift and morph, along with our language to describe it. But not only this, in some ways we find it difficult to conceive of how we could be without changing something about the divine also. Free will is one such example of this. It seems to imply that our actions elicit some response in God. Or even under a system as deterministic as Spinoza's, God's omniscience might entail that he needs to know something about the here and now. I think it likely that somehow this paradox can one way or another be reconciled. That is a subject for another time. So, there is a way in which the divine must be found in the gaps. Even our most absolute sense of the sacred is usually or necessarily accompanied with a gap of reasoning or leap of faith. The subjective side to our lives, at least for now, is probably the most abundant source of novelty and ineffability for one to approach the sacred. It is where one might come to a personal relationship with God. The problem is that every time we look towards the world to perceive the effects of this personal relationship with the sacred, it is difficult to name anything other than what the ego claims as its own. This has been presented as a classical problem for free will and dualism. How is free will possible if we can only conceive of things happening randomly or through causation? How can mind interact with matter if it has an irreducible separation to it? The solution, which seems to make sense, is to posit some platonic or atemporal states which exert logical causation upon a phenomenal world of deterministic or random results. This seems to fit a Kantian metaphysics. Kant trying to solve the problem of how rationality demanded a sort of autonomy and freedom, yet the phenomenal world, or as we have been referring to it as the perceived world, is subject to laws of causation. But this seems to circumvent the problem, understanding the phenomenal world as being that which we are only currently able to talk about. The benefit of this view is that free will no longer seems to require any further explanation than other worldviews must already account for. There must be something either self-caused or necessary to explain existence. and equally we might understand necessary existence to be something existing through its own nature or power. And thus there is no reason to discount the will or desire as having such a property. The problem has always arisen when considering how a free will might react to things in the world without being caused by them. But perhaps this has always been putting the cart before the horse, and the phenomenal world is somehow logically necessitated by this noumenal aspect of desire. The distastefulness of this arises because it seems to render the need for any phenomenal world mute, and a full rebuttal for this is a topic for another video. But my thoughts revolve around both there being a benefit to something being at stake due to the chance of the world, and also that there are times, perhaps, where events in the phenomenal world can change the nature of something atemporal or platonic. Another function of language is automation. Language essentially automates responses to that which was once novel, collapsing the waveform of uncertainty initially present. One function of collapsing the uncertain and novel into a definite linguistic form is of course its communicability. In some ways this is precisely what the linguistic function is. It originated to allow communication to others, including oneself. Linguistic terms are therefore shared terms, and this is in some sense where the objectivity of the linguistic world originates. It is objective because, at least in principle, there is a unity between all those who understand the language, and by extension the objectivity of the categorized world is in some sense not too dissimilar to something agreed upon. Errors can be made by individuals, but if our categories depend on language, in principle there will be at least a set of them which are universally reconcilable. To me it seems as though this is what the objective world actually is. There is, of course, a subjective side to language, not so easily expressed by words, the tone with which a phrase is spoken, the body language one uses to say it, all of which influence reality, but seem to continue to possess some ineffable characteristic. Of course, as we begin to look for what might be the cause of this effect, we simply cast out our linguistic constructs further, inventing new words, stringing together new sentences to describe the influences of tone and body language in objective terms. But despite the seeming ability to continue doing this indefinitely, this does not mean that there will not also always be a subjective, unconscious, non-linguistic side to communication which accompanies our words. Jesus, described as both the Word and the Logos, represents rationality in the sense that he offers a way and a unity for all who partake in the image of God. But this involves not simply speaking the truth, but living without sin also. The world is therein shaped by the Word in a pre-linguistic manner. The Word comes forth from something self-determined, an emotional relationship towards a transcendent ideal. I see a similarity in the way in which people have understood the primary calling to love God and one's neighbor, which in many instances supersedes the Old Testament law, and the subordination of language to this animate and ineffable aspect of one's being. Eliade names our encounters with the sacred hierophanies, where the sacred ruptures through into the world and saturates it with meaning. One of its most fundamental features being its orienting force, acting as a center which connects the profane world to the transcendent and imbues it with purpose. The point of this revelation appears in the world as an axis mundi, a central link between heaven and earth, and it is significant at least for anything due to the fact it is so prevalent across cultures. It manifests as a sacred mountain, temple, pole, or in Christianity through the form of the cross, a threshold between planes of reality. It is precisely this overarching pattern that has led Eliade, Jung, and others to conclude that there is something a priori about the structure of religious belief, and symbols therefore arise through an interplay of an actual and historical situation, with a fundamental and innate religious inclination. The Akilpa tribe demonstrate the potency of this function. Their axis mundi takes the form of a sacred pole, which is carried through the desert, said to represent a pole which their cultural hero, Numbakula, ascended to the world of the gods, receiving the wisdom which established their tradition and culture. It is said that, were this pole to ever break, the Akilpa people would simply lay in the desert and wait to thirst to death. The break of this link between the sacred and the profane removes any hope of meaning whatsoever, and leaves behind an insufferable, intolerable reality. The sacred plays much the same function across the board, if not exactly the same function, despite the differences in actualized presentation. Without the link to the sacred, suffering is an inalienable component to profane life. It allows absolute reality to manifest and offers an escape out of what Eliade names the terror of history. It is only when time is saturated by sacred meaning that it becomes bearable, offering something beyond an otherwise inadequate present, and I believe there is psychological evidence to back this up. I see the abstract terror of history which Eliade talks about, the intolerably inadequate moment of the present, as something akin to the realization that one has turned their backs on their highest ideal, their highest love. The feeling of rejecting God ultimately in favor of sin, a universe unable to provide answers or a loving care and righteousness, being thwarted in all aspirations and forward-thinking hopes. The human spirit therein lacks the will to sacrifice its energy for a cause in vain. And this is where I see sense in the idea of a God in the gaps, the ever-revitalizing, life-giving nature of the sacred, escaping from the jaws of the beast, or through the ever-bureaucratic and imprisoning systems of materialism, the demiurge, the ego who thinks themselves to be God. We seek that one miracle which revitalizes the world and gives it reality, which cannot be accounted for under our usual, limited and blind paradigm. Synchronicity is a great example of this, the conjunction of two events in a meaningful way, which seems to defy the realm of probability. When synchronicity genuinely happens, one is put in the proximity of a higher reality. The world begins working with you in strange ways, and a sense of destiny saturates the world. One can make themselves attracted to these kinds of experiences, similarly to how one can create their own luck. We misunderstand magic when we conceptualize it as a power to immediately gratify the wish of the magician, in a manner which seems to defy law and convention. This is simply how magic would appear from the outside. The magician always has a trick, and our dissatisfaction with fake magic comes when we realize the tricks employed were not so useful as we once thought. Another reaction is exceedingly rare. Good tricks are usually shared for the benefits of others and become something more akin to a technology, or are kept as veiled as possible for their own safety and security. Magic, or miracle, is a relative phenomenon, which is part of the reason why extraordinary events such as revelation and synchronicity operate at such a personal level, and on a collective level with greater difficulty. There is a magic to how prayer works, but a mechanism as well. At the very least, prayer could be said to increase the probability of encountering the sacred, having one's life revitalized by the highest of principles. But I would also urge you to use your imagination to see how it might reach far beyond simply that. There is a sense in which one can attract synchronicity, events which break through the plane of the profane with unaccounted for information. And there is also a sense in which one can simply begin to see the meaning and synchronicity which is already present in the world. How dissimilar these really are, I am not too sure. A miracle is an opportunity to receive information which shatters the current profane, limited paradigm of the ego and materialism, to be drawn towards the God of the gaps which ever transcends verbal comprehension. For one who pays enough attention, perhaps these could take place everywhere and all the time. Over the last few years, I have experienced many instances of déjà vu, the most intense of which lasted in periods up to a minute long, gradually building in strength as they took place. This déjà vu, similar to synchronicity, seemed to allow in information beyond the paradigm I was used to. The feeling that I had been in this situation before, and that feeling of familiarity, a moment that not only stands outside the profane paradigm and gives a unique glimpse into that terror of history, but offers the benefit of allowing insight into how a past version of me reacted to this situation, giving a unique opportunity to judge that person from an outside perspective. And if the experience were prolonged enough, the ability to see the wider context of that person's life, the pitfalls they were headed towards, and their progress in the mission they were trying to complete. I've experienced these types of perceptions during déjà vu increasingly often, and whether they speak of a real past life or not, they stand outside the current paradigm and revitalize reality nonetheless. There is one sense in which considering the possibility of past lives might quickly lead to vapid, New Age fantasizing, but nonetheless the impression of a past life likely does orient and vitalize one in a manner which is unique and also perhaps helpful. I suppose in Hinduism, it is a motivation for seeking truth and righteous action, and the necessary grounds to leading one towards liberation. Since my childhood, I have on occasion had impressions of a message from a past life, another instance of meaning that somehow transcends what I could explain rationally and account for. The message was that I must find a way to work harder in this life before I die, to find the courage to be absolutely committed with my time before I leave. Another manifestation of the pattern comes from the idea of simulation theory, that there could be a practically infinite number of universes, just like ours, that are simulated, and therefore the chance that we inhabit actual reality becomes vanishingly low. The archetypal and religious themes readily saturate this narrative. The pattern repeats where there is but a trace of one transcendent sacred among a sea of the stifling profane. It mimics the patterns in the idea of sin, the idea of the Atman and Brahman, the idea of Descartes' demon and the Gnostic demiurge, among many others, and also the idea that all is under the domain of the mechanistic, so long as we grant that one free miracle. The countless simulations become profane and vapid, but in true reality there is a hierophany of the sacred which sets this apart, some single thread that cuts through the illusion of the many. Meaning takes this form practically wherever one might look. The path is described as straight and narrow, the gate tight where few will enter, the true self like a tiny mustard seed or grain of salt, dissolved into an ocean and undetectable, yet present everywhere at once. In the Gnostic Gospel of Truth, Jesus is described as a good shepherd who rules over his herd which belong to his right hand. Yet when just a single one of the 100 sheep wanders off, this sole sheep alone belongs to Jesus' right hand, until the entire herd be made whole again. The domain of the right hand is placed highest, first and foremost. One possible interpretation speaks to the meaning of creation itself. The flock as the 100 represents unity and totality. Everything is in harmony with the whole and under the domain of the true shepherd. The wandering sheep steps out of the fold, following a curiosity to something beyond and perhaps greater. And one might claim that there is even something special about the sheep which does so. And as such, that which wanders into the beyond must be reconciled back with the whole, and all else becomes in vain until that has been achieved. Or in other words, until God's sovereignty has been established against the wandering spirits of creation, where his glory is only exalted by a world where sin and disobedience is a possibility. And the similarities again are present with the curious, conquering and egoic verbal mind of the left brain, ever wandering into the new territory which the right brain has made possible. And so the simulation theory maps on stunningly well to the themes we have discussed. One must consider which threat of the simulation theory is most pressing, whether it will demoralize, confuse, and destabilize the psychological and social fabric of the true and whole reality which we really do find ourselves within, or whether it truly does suggest that the odds of this world being in vain are exceedingly high, and that higher means or higher knowledge are required to break the illusion. I see this in some sense as a proxy for the conflict between Gnosticism and Christianity more generally. But either way, conflicts like these will likely be solved through courage, wisdom, and faith, rather than mere rationality alone. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I'd like to say that my mind on many of these issues is by no means made up, that this has first and foremost been an investigation into the nature of a very sticky problem, a problem which so often verges on the paradoxical, and my approach to it will undeniably be nascent. So I invite you all to share your thoughts in the comments below, that hopefully we might all move forward in our understanding together. Love and peace.